The Charleston night pulsed with menace as Whiskers crouched low, his golden fur slick against the cobblestones of a shadowed alley. A low growl rumbled from the darkness. A stray dog, eyes glinting with hunger, stalked closer, its teeth bared. Whiskers' emerald eyes narrowed, unyielding, guarding a faint whimper behind him. A tiny creature shivering in a pile of sodden leaves. Rain lashed the alley, cloaking the air in a damp chill that seeped into his bones. His heart pounded, but he stood firm, tail bristling. Would he escape this threat, or had his wanderings led him to a deadly end? The answer lay just beyond the alley's edge, waiting to unfold. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. The rain eased as dawn crept over Charleston, painting the pastel homes of Rainbow Row in hues of peach and gold. Whiskers, no longer in the alley's grip, padded silently through the Bennett's garden gate, his fur still damp but his stride steady. The memory of the night's peril lingered in his tense muscles, though none would guess it from the calm of his emerald eyes. He slipped past Bill's tulip beds, where dew glistened like scattered pearls, and leaped onto the porch of the Bennetts' charming two-story home. Inside, the family stirred, unaware of the cat's nocturnal bravery. Eleanor Ellie Bennett sat in her favorite armchair, a worn copy of Emily Dickinson open on her lap. At 70, her silver hair framed a face etched with quiet strength, though her gray eyes held a wistful shadow. She read softly, her voice a soothing rhythm, while Sophie, her 11-year-old granddaughter, sprawled on the rug, scribbling in a notebook. The girl's brown curls bounced as she sketched a cat with exaggerated whiskers, giggling to herself. Ellie paused, watching Sophie, and felt a pang. Her son, Sophie's father, was a distant voice on the phone, his visits rare. Whiskers, in his own way, filled that void for them both. Bill, 72 and weathered like the live oaks lining their street, poked his head in from the kitchen. "Ellie, that cat's been digging my tulips again," he grumbled, though his tone carried more affection than ire. A retired gardener, he'd spent decades coaxing beauty from Charleston's soil, and Whiskers' antics were a familiar dance. Ellie smiled faintly, her thoughts drifting to 3 years ago when Sophie had changed their lives with a single plea. It had been a breezy evening at the Battery, Charleston's iconic seawall where cannon stood sentinel against the harbor's expanse. Sophie, then 8, had spotted a shivering kitten tucked behind a bench, its golden fur matted with salt and grime. "Grandma, we can't leave him," she'd begged, her hazel eyes wide with urgency. Bill had hesitated. Cats were trouble, he'd said, thinking of scratched furniture and midnight yowls. But Ellie, seeing her son's stubborn spark in Sophie's face, knelt beside the kitten. Its emerald eyes met hers, pleading yet proud, and she'd known he was theirs. They named him Whiskers, a nod to his proud, twitching tufts, and brought him home to Rainbow Row. Now Whiskers was no ordinary cat. He had a knack for fetching Sophie's sneakers, dropping them at her feet with a smug purr. He'd nudge Ellie's hand when she lingered too long over old letters, as if sensing her heart's ache. Once he'd even unlatched the screen door to join Bill in the garden, earning a rare chuckle from the old man. Sophie swore he understood her stories, his ears twitching at her dramatic pauses. But lately Ellie had noticed a change. Whiskers lingered by the window, staring toward the Ashley River, his usual playfulness dimmed. As morning unfolded, Charleston came alive. Horse-drawn carriages clopped down Meeting Street, their drivers' tails mingling with the salty breeze. Neighbors waved from porches, their voices warm with low-country drawl. Ellie set her book aside, joining Sophie on the rug. "What's Whiskers doing in your story today?" she asked, brushing a curl from the girl's forehead. "He's a pirate cat," Sophie declared, holding up her sketch. "Sailing the harbor, saving lost kittens." Her grin faltered as she glanced at Whiskers, now curled on the windowsill. "But he looks sad, Grandma. Do cats get sad?" Ellie's chest tightened. She'd wondered the same, watching Whiskers' gaze drift to the river. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "even cats have things on their minds." Her thoughts flicked to the alley. Though she didn't know of Whiskers' encounter, she sensed his restlessness, a mirror to her own. She'd felt it since her son moved west, leaving Sophie in their care while he chased a career. Whiskers like hers seemed to carry an unspoken weight. Bill shuffled in, wiping flour from his hands. He'd been kneading dough for biscuits, a Sunday ritual. "If that cat's sad, it's 'cause he knows I'm onto his tulip crimes," he teased, winking at Sophie. But his eyes met Ellie's, and she saw his concern. Whiskers hadn't touched his breakfast, a rarity for a cat who usually pounced on kibble. "Let's keep an eye on him," Ellie said, her voice steady despite the worry curling in her gut. She rose, smoothing her cardigan, and stepped onto the porch. The air smelled of magnolias and sea, Charleston's signature blend. Whiskers followed, leaping to the railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. What was out there pulling him away? Ellie wondered, her fingers brushing his fur. Across the street, Dorothy Dot Harper swept her porch, her sharp eyes catching Whiskers' movement. At 75, Dot was a fixture on Rainbow Row, her tongue as quick as her broom. She'd grumbled before about Whiskers knocking over her geraniums, her complaints laced with something deeper, a distrust Ellie couldn't place. Now? Dot paused, watching the cat with a frown, and Ellie felt a prickle of unease. As the sun climbed, Sophie bounded outside, her notebook tucked under her arm. "Whiskers, come play!" she called, tossing a toy mouse. Whiskers glanced at her, his tail flicking, but didn't budge. Sophie's face fell, and Ellie knelt beside her, hiding her own concern. "He's just dreaming of pirate ships," she said, forcing a smile. But her mind churned. Whiskers' distance wasn't just a mood. Something was stirring, something beyond their quiet home. At dusk, as the sky bled orange over Charleston steeples, Whiskers slipped through the garden gate again. His silhouette vanished into the lengthening shadows, leaving Sophie staring after him. Ellie watched from the porch, her heart heavy with questions. What called him out there into the city's hidden corners? She couldn't know that Whiskers' nightly quest were only beginning, or that they'd soon unravel a mystery that would change them all. The Charleston night had faded into memory, but its echo lingered in Whiskers' taut frame as he curled on the Bennetts' living room rug. Moonlight spilled through the window, casting silver threads across his golden fur, though his emerald eyes stayed fixed on some distant point beyond the glass. The house was quiet, save for the soft creak of Ellie's rocking chair and the scratch of Sophie's pencil against her notebook. Ellie, her silver hair glowing faintly in the lamplight, sipped chamomile tea, her thoughts drifting like the marsh fog outside. She'd noticed Whiskers' unease all day, his untouched bowl of kibble, his stillness by the window, and it stirred a worry she couldn't name. Sophie, sprawled on the floor, paused her sketching to glance at Whiskers. At 11, she was all heart and imagination, her hazel eyes catching every shift in her cat's mood. She'd drawn him as a pirate that morning, but now her pencil traced a simpler shape. Whiskers alone, gazing at the river. "Grandma," she said, her voice small. "Why's he so quiet? He didn't even chase the yarn today." Ellie set her mug down, her gray eyes softening. "Cats have their secrets, sweetheart," she said, though her tone hid a tremor. She remembered her son's silences before he left Charleston, a wound that hadn't healed. Bill shuffled in from the kitchen, his flannel shirt dusted with garden soil. He'd spent the evening pruning azaleas, a task that grounded him after years tending Charleston's parks. "That cat's just plotting his next tulip heist," he said, winking at Sophie. But his gaze lingered on Whiskers, and Ellie caught the flicker of concern in his weathered face. Bill wasn't one for fussing, but Whiskers had burrowed into his heart, much as he'd grumble otherwise. "Maybe he's got a lady friend out there," he added, hoping to lighten the mood. Sophie giggled, but Ellie's smile was thin. She knew Whiskers' distance wasn't so simple. The living room, with its faded floral curtains and oak bookshelves, felt like a cocoon against Charleston's restless pulse. Outside, lantern-lit streets wound through Rainbow Row, their cobblestones slick from an earlier drizzle. The city hummed with stories, tales of pirates, hurricanes, and quiet acts of grace. But tonight Whiskers seemed to carry a story of his own. Ellie rose, smoothing her cardigan, and knelt beside him. His fur was warm under her fingers, but he didn't lean into her touch as usual. "What's out there, old friend?" she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Sophie tucked her notebook away, crawling closer. "Maybe he's on a mission," she said, her eyes bright with the tales she spun. "Like saving someone, like he saved that sparrow." Ellie's mind flicked to the memory. Last spring, Whiskers had guarded an injured bird in their garden, hissing at curious squirrels until Maggie Tate, the vet, nursed it back to flight. The neighborhood had buzzed with the story, vendors at the farmer's market slipping Whiskers extra treats. But this felt different, heavier, as if Whiskers carried a burden only he could see. Across the street, Dorothy Dot Harper swept her porch, her broom scraping rhythmically against the wood. At 75, Dot was a Charleston fixture, her sharp tongue as known as her immaculate geraniums. She'd never warmed to Whiskers, claiming he'd toppled her flower pots one too many times. Now her eyes narrowed as she spotted him in the Bennett's window, his silhouette stark against the lamplight. "Up to no good, that one," she muttered, her words swallowed by the night. Dot's distrust wasn't just about flowers. Years ago she'd lost a dog to a careless driver, and the ache had hardened her heart to strays. Ellie didn't see Dot's glare, but she felt the weight of judgment. Charleston was a city of neighbors, yet gossip flowed like the Ashley River, swift and unforgiving. She stood brushing off her unease, and guided Sophie to bed. "Whiskers'll be fine," she said, tucking the girl in. But as she closed Sophie's door, her thoughts churned. Whiskers hadn't been himself since yesterday's dusk, when he'd slipped out and returned with mud on his paws. What was he chasing in those shadowed alleys? Downstairs, Bill sat with a newspaper, though his eyes weren't on the print. He remembered Whiskers' first weeks in their home, a trembling kitten, hiding under the sofa. Sophie had spent hours coaxing him out, her voice soft as she read from her storybooks. Bill had scoffed then. Cats were trouble, he'd said, but Whiskers had proved him wrong. He'd learned to fetch Sophie's slippers, his proud strut earning Bill's grudging respect. Now, seeing the cat so still, Bill felt a knot in his chest. "Ellie," he called softly. "You think he's sick?" Ellie paused on the stairs, her hand gripping the banister. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I'll call Maggie tomorrow." Her voice was steady, but her mind raced. Whiskers wasn't just a pet. He was their anchor, a bridge to the son who drifted away. Losing him even to some fleeting ailment was a thought she couldn't bear. As she settled into bed, the house creaked around her, and she wondered what secrets Whiskers carried from the night. At dawn, Whiskers stirred, his eyes catching the first light. He slipped through the screen door, silent as a ghost, and vanished into Charleston's waking streets. Ellie, still asleep, dreamed of her son's laughter, while Sophie clutched her notebook, dreaming of Whiskers' next adventure. Neither knew that the cat's quiet was only the beginning, a prelude to a saga that would test their hearts and bind their city closer. The Charleston Farmers Market buzzed under a canopy of live oaks, the air thick with the scent of fresh peaches and pralines. Stalls overflowed with low-country bounty, shrimp fresh from the docks, okra piled high, and jars of golden honey glinting in the sun. Ellie wove through the crowd, her wicker basket heavy with groceries for a Sunday boil. Sophie skipped beside her, clutching a bag of pecans, her hazel eyes darting to every corner. Whiskers wasn't with them today, a rare absence that gnawed at Ellie's peace. She'd woken to find his bowl untouched again, his spot by the window empty. "Grandma, look!" Sophie pointed to a vendor tossing a shrimp to a seagull, her giggle cutting through the market's hum. Ellie smiled, but her thoughts stayed with Whiskers. Last night's worry had deepened. His stillness wasn't just a mood. She'd called Maggie Tate before leaving a message about his odd behavior. Now, surrounded by Charleston's warmth, she felt a chill she couldn't shake. James Jim Lawson waved from his bookstall, his gray beard framing a grin. At 68, he was Charleston's unofficial historian, his tiny shop on King Street a trove of stories. "Where's our hero today?" he called, adjusting his glasses. Jim had a soft spot for Whiskers, often slipping him bits of biscuit during market days. Sophie bounded over, her curls bouncing. "He's at home being mysterious," she said, mimicking a spy's whisper. Jim chuckled, but Ellie caught the question in his eyes. "Whiskers hasn't been himself," she admitted, setting her basket down. "Skips meals, stares at the river. I'm waiting on Maggie's call." Jim nodded, his fingers tracing the spine of a weathered novel. "That cat's got a heart bigger than Charleston," he said. "Remember the squirrel?" Ellie did. Last fall, during a storm that rattled Rainbow Row, Whiskers had dragged a soaked squirrel kit to their porch, guarding it until the rain stopped. The market had buzzed with the tale, vendors dubbing him the guardian of Meeting Street. Sophie tugged Ellie's sleeve. "Tell Mr. Jim about the sparrow, too," she urged. Ellie obliged, her voice softening. Months ago, Whiskers had stood sentinel over an injured sparrow in their garden, hissing at curious dogs until Maggie nursed it back to flight. Jim leaned in, his eyes twinkling. "Sounds like Charleston's own legend," he said, weaving the story into the city's tapestry of resilience, tales of neighbors rebuilding after floods, sharing meals during hard times. His words lifted Ellie's spirits, reminding her why she loved this place, despite its occasional sharp edges. But those edges appeared as Dorothy Harper approached. Her straw hat tilted against the sun. Dot's lips pursed as she overheard Jim's praise. "That cat's no legend," she said, her voice clipped. "Knocked over my geraniums again last week." Ellie stiffened, her fingers tightening on her basket. "He's just spirited, Dot," she said evenly, though irritation flared. Dot sniffed, turning to a nearby vendor with a pointed glance. "Spirited's one word for it. I've seen him slinking around at night, up to who knows what." Sophie's face fell and Ellie placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her away. "Don't mind her," she whispered, though Dot's words stung. Charleston was a city of stories, but not all were kind. Ellie knew Dot's grumbling hid something deeper, a loss she'd never shared, but it didn't soften the barb. As they moved to a shrimp stall, Sophie clutched her pecans tighter. "Whiskers isn't bad," she said almost to herself. Ellie nodded, her resolve hardening. She'd get answers from Maggie, whatever it took. Bill met them at the market's edge, his truck parked under a palmetto tree. He'd been hauling compost all morning, his flannel sleeves rolled up despite the heat. "Got enough for a feast?" he asked, eyeing their haul. Ellie forced a smile, handing him the basket. "Shrimp, okra, the works," she said. But her voice faltered as she glanced at Sophie, who stared at her shoes. Bill raised an eyebrow, sensing the shift. "Dot again?" he guessed, his tone dry. Ellie nodded, climbing into the truck. "She's got it in for Whiskers," she said, buckling Sophie in. Bill grunted, starting the engine. "Let her talk. That cat's worth 10 of her flower pots." But as they drove down Meeting Street, Ellie's thoughts returned to Whiskers. She pictured him by the window, his gaze locked on the Ashley River, as if drawn by an invisible thread. What was out there, pulling him away from them? At home, Whiskers hadn't moved from the sill. His tail was still, his eyes unblinking, fixed on the horizon where river met sky. Ellie set the groceries down, her heart sinking. She knelt beside him, stroking his fur, but he didn't stir. Sophie hovered nearby, her notebook forgotten. "He's thinking about something big," she said, her voice trembling with hope and fear. Ellie wanted to believe it, but the weight of Whiskers' silence pressed harder, a mystery deepening with each passing hour. Outside, Charleston shimmered in the midday sun, its steeples piercing a cloudless sky. The market's laughter faded, replaced by the river's quiet pull. Whiskers' secret, whatever it was, lay out there, waiting to unravel. Ellie stood, her hand lingering on Whiskers' back, and made a silent vow. She'd find out what haunted him before it pulled him too far from home. The Charleston sun hung low, casting a golden haze over Rainbow Row as Ellie Bennett stood on her porch, her gray eyes scanning the garden for Whiskers. His absence at the farmer's market still gnawed at her, a quiet ache that deepened with each day of his strange behavior, skipped meals, endless stares toward the Ashley River. Inside, Sophie sat cross-legged on the living room rug, her notebook open to a half-finished sketch of Whiskers, his emerald eyes drawn too large, too sad. Bill, wiping sweat from his brow after a morning in the garden, sensed the tension but said nothing, his calloused hands fidgeting with a coffee mug. The house felt heavier than usual, as if Whiskers' silence had seeped into its walls. Ellie stepped inside, her cardigan catching the breeze from an open window. "Sophie, sweetheart, why don't you put that away and help me with lunch?" she said, her voice gentle but strained. Sophie nodded, closing her notebook, though her gaze lingered on Whiskers, now curled by the windowsill. His golden fur gleamed, but his stillness was unnerving, a far cry from the cat who'd once pounced on her shoelaces. Ellie followed Sophie's look, her heart twisting. She'd left a message for Maggie Tate, the veterinarian, but waiting felt like wading through marsh mud, slow, uncertain. The kitchen smelled of butter and thyme as Ellie chopped onions for a low-country stew. Sophie perched on a stool, peeling shrimp with careful fingers, her chatter about school fading when Whiskers patted in. He ignored his water bowl, leaping back to the sill, his eyes locked on the river's distant shimmer. "Grandma," Sophie said, her voice small, "what if he's sick? Like, really sick? Ellie paused, knife hovering, and forced a smile. "Cats get moody sometimes," she said, echoing Bill's earlier quip. But the words felt hollow. She'd seen Whiskers through colds and scrapes, but this was different. Something deeper, almost mournful. Bill joined them, his boots leaving faint dirt trails on the floor. "Called Maggie yet?" he asked, pouring coffee. Ellie nodded, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Left a message. She's probably out with a patient." Bill grunted, glancing at Whiskers. "He's tough, Ellie. Tougher than my roses in a frost." But his tone lacked conviction, and Ellie caught the worry in his weathered eyes. Whiskers wasn't just a pet. He was their glue, a living thread to Sophie's laughter, to the son who'd left them for a life out west. Losing that thread was unthinkable. A knock at the door broke the moment. Ellie opened it to find James Lawson, his gray beard dusted with pollen from a morning walk. "Heard you're fretting over Whiskers," he said, stepping inside with a paper bag of books for Sophie. At 68, Jim's bookstore was a Charleston haven, its shelves heavy with tales of the Low Country's heart. Sophie brightened, grabbing the bag, but Ellie's smile was tight. "He's not eating, Jim," she said, leading him to the kitchen. "Just sits there watching the river." Jim knelt beside Whiskers, his fingers brushing the cat's fur. "You're a puzzle, aren't you?" he murmured, then turned to Ellie. "Reminds me of the old lighthouse keepers, always looking for something out there." His words were light, but Ellie felt their weight. She'd grown up on stories of Charleston's resilience, of neighbors banding together after storms, but Whiskers' gaze seemed to search for something personal, something lost. As Jim left, promising to check in, Ellie's phone buzzed. Maggie Tate's voice crackled through, warm but brisk. "Ellie, I could see Whiskers this afternoon. Bring him by at 2. Relief flooded Ellie, though it came with a new fear. What if Maggie found something serious? She hung up, meeting Sophie's wide eyes. "We're taking him to Maggie," she said, squeezing the girl's shoulder. Sophie nodded, her fingers twisting the hem of her shirt, already imagining Whiskers bounding back to his old self. The drive to Maggie's clinic wound through Charleston's historic heart. Past church steeples and palmetto trees swaying in the breeze, Sophie clutched Whiskers' carrier, whispering to him through the mesh. "You're gonna be fine," she said, though her voice trembled. Ellie glanced at Bill, his hands steady on the wheel, but she saw the tension in his jaw. The clinic, a cozy brick building near the battery, smelled of antiseptic and hay. Its walls lined with photos of rescued dogs and cats. Maggie greeted them, her dark hair pulled back, her smile easing Ellie's nerves. "All right, let's see our hero," Maggie said, lifting Whiskers onto the exam table. His fur bristled, but he didn't fight, his eyes meeting Maggie's with a quiet trust. She checked his vitals, her hands deft, her brow furrowing as she pressed his belly. Ellie held her breath, Sophie's hand slipping into hers. After a moment, Maggie looked up, her expression shifting to surprise. "Well, I'll be," she said, almost to herself. "Ellie, Whiskers isn't sick. He's expecting kittens." The words hung in the air, a shock that silenced the room. Sophie gasped, her face splitting into a grin. "Kittens? Like babies?" Maggie nodded, chuckling. "Looks like it. He's healthy, just pregnant. Probably why he's been off. Hormones and all." Ellie blinked, her mind racing. Kittens? Whiskers, their sly rogue. A mother? Bill let out a low whistle, scratching his head. "Didn't see that coming," he muttered, but his eyes softened, picturing tiny paws pattering through their home. Maggie explained the basics. Special food, a quiet nesting spot, regular checkups. "He's young, but we'll keep a close eye," she said, her tone reassuring. Ellie nodded, still processing, her thoughts tumbling back to her own motherhood, to the son who'd grown distant. Whiskers, carrying life, felt like a mirror to her own hopes and losses. Sophie bounced on her toes, already naming kittens in her head: Star, Clover, Moon. But Ellie caught a flicker in Whisker's eyes, a depth that hinted at more than instinct. Back home, Sophie raided the linen closet, piling quilts for a kitten bed. "They'll need to be cozy," she said, her voice bright with purpose. Ellie helped, though her hands moved slower, her mind elsewhere. She pictured Whiskers in the garden, his gaze still river-bound as if the kittens were only part of his story. Bill hauled a bag of cat food from the market, grumbling about costs, but already planning a nursery corner. The house buzzed with new energy, yet Ellie felt a nagging unease. Whisker's secret wasn't fully unveiled. Across the street, Dorothy Harper watched from her porch, her broom idle. She'd seen the Bennett's truck return, Whisker's carrier in tow, and her lips pursed. "Trouble brewing," she muttered, her voice low. Dot didn't know about the kittens, but she'd spotted Whiskers slipping out at dusk, his shadow darting toward the river. To her it spelled mischief, and she wasn't one to stay quiet. As Ellie tucked Sophie in that night, promising kitten cuddles soon, she didn't see Dot's frown, didn't hear the whisper of gossip taking root, a spark that would soon test their fragile hope. Rain lashed Charleston's cobblestones, turning Rainbow Row into a watercolor blur. Inside the Bennett's garden shed, under a magnolia tree's dripping branches, Whiskers lay curled in a nest of old blankets. The air was thick with damp earth and sorrow. Ellie stood frozen at the shed's door, her cardigan soaked, her gray eyes wide with disbelief. 3 tiny kittens, barely formed, lay still beside Whiskers, their fragile bodies untouched by breath. Whiskers nudged them, his golden fur matted, his soft purrs breaking into desperate mews. Each nudge was a plea, a refusal to accept the truth, and Ellie's heart cracked at the sight. She'd found him at dawn, drawn by a faint cry after a sleepless night. The kittens had come too soon, Maggie later confirmed, her voice heavy over the phone. "It happens sometimes, Ellie, especially with young cats," she'd said, promising to stop by. But no explanation softened the scene. Whiskers's emerald eyes, usually so sharp, were clouded with grief, searching for life where none remained. Ellie knelt, her knees sinking into the damp floor, and reached for him. "Oh, Whiskers," she whispered, her voice breaking. He didn't pull away, but he didn't lean in either. His focus locked on his lost babies. Sophie appeared in the doorway, her pajamas muddy, her hazel eyes wide with confusion. "Grandma, what's wrong?" she asked, then saw the kittens. Her gasp cut through the rain's patter, and she dropped to her knees beside Ellie. "They're not moving," she said, her voice trembling. Ellie wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close, but words failed her. She wanted to shield Sophie, to promise everything would be all right, but the weight of Whisker's pain swallowed her assurances. Sophie reached out, her fingers hovering over a kitten, then drew back, tears spilling. Bill shuffled in, his boots heavy against the shed's floorboards. He'd been up early, checking the garden after the storm, when Ellie's call had brought him running. His weathered face paled at the sight, and he crouched beside Whiskers, his hand hovering, unsure. "Poor fella," he muttered, his voice rough. Bill wasn't one for tears, but Ellie saw the quiver in his jaw, the same he'd shown when Sophie's parents left her in their care. He stood fetching a small wooden box from his tools, his hands steady despite the ache in his chest. "We'll give him a proper rest," he said, more to himself than anyone. Maggie arrived as the rain slowed, her raincoat dripping as she knelt beside Whiskers. She examined the kittens gently, confirming what Ellie feared: stillborn, no chance of revival. "He did everything he could," Maggie said, her dark eyes meeting Ellie's. "Sometimes nature decides." She gave Whiskers a soft stroke, but he didn't respond. His body curled protectively around the tiny forms. Maggie glanced at Sophie, who clung to Ellie, and lowered her voice. "He'll need time, Ellie. Keep him close, but don't push." Ellie nodded, though her thoughts spiraled. She saw herself in Whiskers, holding on to her son's memory, willing him back to Charleston despite the years. Her son's calls were brief, his visits rarer, and each silence cut deeper. Now, watching Whiskers, she felt that same helpless longing to fix what was broken, to hold tight to what was gone. She guided Sophie inside, promising hot cocoa. But the girl's steps were slow. Her usual spark dimmed. "Will he be okay, Grandma?" Sophie asked, her voice barely audible. Ellie forced a nod, but doubt gnawed at her. Bill stayed with Whiskers, nailing the box shut with careful taps. He buried it under the magnolia, the earth soft from rain, and marked it with a smooth river stone. Whiskers watched, his eyes unblinking, then returned to his nest, licking the blankets as if the kittens might still wake. Bill lingered, his flannel shirt damp, feeling useless against such loss. He'd grown up on a farm, seen animals come and go. But Whiskers wasn't livestock, he was family, his pain as real as any human's. Inside, Ellie warmed milk for Coco, her hands moving on instinct. Sophie sat at the kitchen table, staring at her untouched mug. "I wanted to name them," she said, her voice cracking. "Star, Clover, Moon." Ellie sat beside her, brushing a curl from her face. "Those are beautiful names," she said, her throat tight. She pictured Sophie's joy days ago, piling quilts for the kittens, and felt a stab of guilt. Had she let hope grow too fast? But Sophie's next words surprised her. "Whiskers love them already," she said, wiping her eyes. "That's why he's so sad." Ellie hugged her, marveling at the girl's insight. She thought of Charleston's stories, of rebuilding after floods, of neighbors sharing what little they had. Loss was part of life here, but so was carrying on. Yet Whiskers' grief felt raw, unshaped, and Ellie wondered how to help him through it. She glanced outside, where he remained in the shed, a golden shadow against the gloom. Across the street, Dorothy Harper peered through her curtains, her broom idle. She'd seen Maggie's truck, heard Sophie's muffled sobs, and pieced together a tragedy. Dot's lips pursed, her usual sharpness softened by a flicker of memory. Her dog, hit years ago, left her wary of attachment. She didn't cross the street, didn't offer words, but her frown held less venom than before. Whiskers' loss, though she didn't know its shape, stirred something she'd buried deep. Days passed, and Whiskers barely moved from the shed. Ellie brought him food, her voice soft as she coaxed, but he only nibbled, his eyes distant. Sophie read to him, her stories faltering, while Bill checked the shed nightly, his silence heavy with worry. Ellie felt the house shift, its warmth dimmed by Whiskers' absence. She lay awake, listening to the river's faint rush, and wondered what lay ahead. Whiskers' heart had broken, but she sensed it wasn't the end. Something new was stirring, waiting to rise from the ashes of his grief. The Charleston summer dawned with a blaze, the air heavy with jasmine and salt as sunlight spilled across the Bennetts' backyard. Ellie stood at the kitchen window, her gray eyes tracing the garden where Whiskers had buried his grief. A week had passed since the stillborn kittens, and though he'd left the shed, his spark hadn't returned. He lay under the magnolia tree now, his golden fur dull, his emerald eyes fixed on the Ashley River's distant glint. Ellie's hands paused over a bowl of biscuit dough, her heart aching for the cat, who'd once danced after Sophie's yarn. She wondered if he'd ever find his way back to them. Inside, Sophie sat at the table, her notebook open but untouched, her hazel eyes shadowed. At 11, she felt Whiskers' sorrow as keenly as her own, her stories silenced by the weight of his loss. Bill shuffled in from the garden, his flannel shirt damp with sweat, his weathered face tight with concern. "He's still out there, staring," he said, pouring coffee. Ellie nodded, her fingers kneading dough on instinct. "I thought time would help," she said softly, "but he's slipping further away." Bill grunted, his gaze flicking to Sophie, who hadn't spoken all morning. The house, with its faded curtains and oak bookshelves, felt stifled, as if Whiskers' silence had thickened the air. Charleston hummed outside. Carriages clopped down Meeting Street. Neighbors chatted over picket fences. But the Bennetts' world had narrowed to their cat's quiet pain. Ellie set the dough aside, wiping her hands on her apron. "Sophie, let's check on him," she said, hoping movement might lift the girl's spirits. Sophie followed, her steps slow, clutching a toy mouse she'd once used to coax Whiskers into play. In the garden, the magnolia's shade offered little relief from the heat. Whiskers lay sprawled, his tail still, ignoring the sparrows flitting above. Sophie knelt beside him, her voice trembling. "Whiskers, you gotta come inside," she said, dangling the mouse. He blinked, his eyes meeting hers for a moment, but didn't stir. Ellie crouched too, stroking his fur, her throat tight. She saw her son's distance in Whiskers' gaze, a longing she couldn't reach. "We're here, old friend," she murmured, though doubt crept in. Were they enough? A rustle broke the moment. Sophie turned, her eyes widening as Whiskers rose, his ears twitching. From the garden's edge near the wrought iron fence came a faint whimper. Whiskers moved, slow at first, then with purpose, his body low as he slipped through the grass. Ellie and Sophie followed, their breath catching as he reached the fence. There, nestled in a patch of clover, was a tiny black puppy, its eyes barely open, shivering despite the heat. Whiskers paused, then gently lifted it in his mouth, his touch as soft as a whisper. Ellie gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Sophie froze, her voice a squeak. "Grandma, is that a dog?" Whiskers carried the puppy to the lawn, setting it down with care. He licked its fur, his purrs low and steady as if it were his own kitten. The puppy squirmed, nuzzling closer, and Whiskers curled around it, his eyes brighter than they'd been in days. Ellie knelt, her cardigan brushing the grass, her mind reeling. Where had it come from? Why was Whiskers, a cat, mothering a dog? Bill appeared, drawn by their voices, his coffee mug forgotten. "What in tarnation?" he muttered, squinting at the scene. The puppy, no bigger than a teacup, whimpered softly, and Whiskers' purrs grew louder, a shield against the world. Sophie's face lit up, her grief giving way to wonder. "He's saving it, Grandpa," she said, clasping her hands. Bill scratched his head, his pragmatism warring with awe. "Saving or stealing, we gotta figure this out," he said, but his tone held no edge. Ellie's thoughts spun. She remembered her mother's tales of Charleston's miracles, neighbors sharing bread during lean times, strangers aiding after storms. Whiskers' act felt like one of those stories, raw and improbable. "We can't leave it here," she said, her voice firm despite her shock. Bill nodded, fetching an old blanket from the shed, the same one Whiskers had nested in. Sophie wrapped the puppy gently, naming it Onyx for its coal-black fur. Whiskers stayed close, his eyes never leaving the bundle, as if guarding a fragile hope. They brought Onyx inside, settling him in a laundry basket lined with towels. Whiskers hopped in, curling around the puppy, his warmth a steady pulse. Ellie watched, her heart swelling with a mix of fear and pride. She'd seen Whiskers care for sparrows and squirrels, but this was different, deeper, as if he'd found a way to heal. Sophie sat cross-legged, her notebook open again, sketching Whiskers and Onyx with furious strokes. "He's a hero, Grandma," she said, her voice bright but trembling, as if afraid to believe it. Bill called James Lawson, needing a friend's perspective. Jim arrived, his gray beard flecked with dust from his bookstore, and stopped short at the sight. "Well, I'll be darned," he said, kneeling by the basket. "Whiskers, you're rewriting Charleston's tales." He shared a story of a fisherman who'd saved a stranded dolphin, tying Whiskers' act to the city's legacy of compassion. Ellie listened, her unease easing, but questions lingered. Where was the puppy's mother? Was Whiskers safe wandering alone? Across the street, Dorothy Harper watched from her porch, her broom idle. She'd seen Whiskers slip through the fence, returning with something in his mouth, and her lips pursed. "Trouble," she muttered, her voice low. Dot didn't know about Onyx, but her distrust of Whiskers had roots. Her dog, lost years ago, had left her wary of strays. She turned inside, her mind already spinning tales of mischief, unaware of the miracle unfolding next door. Ellie sat by the basket that night, her fingers brushing Whiskers' fur. Onyx slept, Whiskers' purrs a steady lullaby. She thought of her son, of the letters she still wrote, hoping for a reply. Whiskers had lost his kittens, yet here he was, giving love to a stranger's pup. Maybe, she thought, healing came in unexpected forms. But as she glanced at the window, the river's shadow loomed, and she wondered what else Whiskers sought in Charleston's hidden corners. The Charleston heat clung like a second skin, turning the Bennetts' living room into a makeshift nursery. Towels and blankets spilled across the floor, cradling 5 black puppies, Onyx, Dusk, Ember, Raven, and Mist, each brought home by Whiskers over the past 4 days. The cat lay among them, his golden fur a stark contrast to their cold, dark coats, his emerald eyes watchful as they tumbled over his paws. Ellie stood in the doorway, her cardigan loose despite the warmth, marveling at the sight. Whiskers had become a mother, his grief transformed into a quiet devotion that reshaped their home. Sophie knelt beside the puppies, her notebook filled with their quirks, Onyx's tiny sneezes, Dusk's bold waddle, Ember's sleepy yawns. At 11, she'd traded stories for this new reality, her hazel eyes bright with purpose. "They're his family now," she said, stroking Raven's fur. Ellie nodded, though her heart fluttered with questions. Whiskers' nightly quest to the river had yielded this unlikely brood, but where were they coming from? And why was he, a cat, nursing dogs? Bill, hauling a bag of puppy formula from the market, grumbled as he tripped over a chew toy. "This house ain't big enough for a zoo," he said, but his eyes softened at Mist, who gnawed his bootlace. He'd built a wooden pen in the corner, his gardener's hands steady despite the chaos. Ellie helped mix formula, her thoughts drifting to Whiskers' first pup, Onyx, and the wonder of that morning. Now, with 5, the miracle felt both bigger and heavier. How could they care for them all? Maggie Tate arrived, her vet bag slung over her shoulder, her dark hair tied back against the heat. She knelt by the pen, her eyes widening as Whiskers licked Dusk's face, coaxing a milk-drunk burp. "This is extraordinary," she said, her voice tinged with awe. She checked the puppies, confirming they were healthy, then watched Whiskers nurse them. His body curled protectively. "Cross-species nursing is rare," she explained, meeting Ellie's gaze. "His milk's sustaining them somehow." It's like he knew they needed him. Ellie's breath caught, her mind flashing to Whiskers' lost kittens. She saw his pain in every gentle lick, every patient nudge. Sophie, listening, clutched her notebook, her voice soft. "He's giving them what he couldn't give his babies," she said, and Ellie's eyes stung, struck by the girl's clarity. Bill, leaning against the wall, cleared his throat, his gruffness melting. "Dang cat's got more heart than half the folks I know," he muttered, turning to hide a sheen in his eyes. Maggie stayed an hour, teaching them to bottle feed the puppies to ease Whiskers' load. "He can't keep this up alone," she said, showing Sophie how to hold the tiny bottles. Whiskers watched, his purrs steady as if approving the help. Ellie marveled at his trust, so different from the cat who'd hidden under their sofa years ago. But as Maggie left, she warned them, "We need to find their mother. Puppies don't just appear." Ellie nodded, her unease returning. Whiskers' river runs were a mystery they couldn't ignore. The neighborhood began to stir with whispers. James Lawson stopped by, his bookstore tales now centered on Whiskers' puppy parade. He brought a bag of biscuits, joking that Whiskers deserved a medal. "Charleston's seen odd things, ghosts, storms, but this beats all," he said, kneeling to pet Ember. His optimism lifted Sophie, who read him her puppy diary, her voice ringing with pride. But Ellie caught a shadow in Jim's eyes. He'd heard murmurs, doubts about Whiskers' finds. Across the street, Dorothy Harper's porch was a stage for suspicion. Dot had seen Whiskers return with Raven, then missed, her broom stalling as she watched. "Stealing dogs, that's what," she told a neighbor, her voice sharp but unsteady. Her dog's death years ago had left her guarded, and Whiskers' actions felt like a challenge to her ordered world. She didn't knock on the Bennetts' door, didn't ask, but her words spread, a slow poison seeping through Charleston's alleys. Ellie sensed the shift, though no one spoke it aloud. Neighbors' smiles tightened when she passed, their glances lingering on her garden gate. She kept the puppies inside, fearing curious eyes, but Whiskers slipped out at dusk, his shadow vanishing toward the river. Sophie watched from the window, her fingers gripping her notebook. "He's not stealing," she whispered as if to convince herself. Ellie hugged her, her own doubts buried deep. She trusted Whiskers, but the unknown loomed large. Bill rigged a fan to cool the living room, his grumbling a cover for worry. "We can't keep him forever," he said, eyeing the pen. Ellie nodded, but her heart wasn't in it. The puppies were Whiskers' salvation, and sending them away felt like betraying him. She thought of Charleston's history, families opening homes to strangers after floods, churches sharing pews with the lost. Whiskers was their flood, their test, and she wouldn't fail him. That night, Ellie sat by the pen watching Whiskers nurse Mist, his purrs a steady hymn. Sophie slept upstairs, her diary open to a sketch of their new family. Bill dozed in his chair, the radio humming gospel. Outside, the river flowed, its secrets pulling Whiskers back. Ellie whispered to him, her voice low. "What's out there calling you?" She didn't know that his answer was coming, a truth that would shake their world and test Charleston's heart. The Charleston summer pressed against the Bennets' home, its heat seeping through the open windows as the living room hummed with the soft yips of 5 black puppies, Onyx, Dusk, Ember, Raven, and Mist. Whiskers lay among them, his golden fur a beacon in the makeshift pen, his emerald eyes tracking their every tumble. Ellie stood in the doorway, her cardigan loose despite the warmth, her gray eyes clouded with unease. The puppies had brought Whiskers back from his grief, but whispers were spreading through Rainbow Row, turning their miracle into a puzzle. She felt the neighborhood's gaze, sharp and questioning, and it stirred a protective instinct she hadn't known since her son left. Sophie knelt by the pen, her notebook open to a page of puppy sketches, her hazel eyes bright but wary. At 11, she sensed the shift in the air, though she couldn't name it. "Grandma, they're getting bigger," she said, stroking Ember's fur. "Whiskers is so proud." Ellie nodded, forcing a smile, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Dorothy Harper's frown yesterday. The way neighbors' chatter hushed when she passed. Bill shuffled in from the garden, his flannel shirt damp, his weathered face tight. "Folks are talking," he said, setting down a bag of kibble. "Dot's got half the street thinking Whiskers is a thief." Ellie's stomach knotted. She'd hoped the rumors would fade, that Whiskers' care for the puppies would speak louder than gossip. But Charleston, for all its warmth, loved a story, and Dot's version, Whiskers stealing dogs from some poor mother, was gaining ground. "They don't know him," she said, her voice sharper than intended. Sophie looked up, her fingers pausing on Raven's ear. "He's not a thief," she said, her voice small but fierce. Ellie knelt beside her, brushing a curl from her face. "Of course he isn't, sweetheart," she said, though doubt crept in. Not about Whiskers, but about how to prove it. The morning unfolded in a haze of routine. Ellie mixed puppy formula, her hand steady despite her racing mind. Bill rigged a second fan to cool the room, grumbling about vet bills but pausing to scratch Mist's chin. Sophie read her diary aloud, her voice weaving tales of Whiskers' heroics, though her glances at the window betrayed her worry. Whiskers, oblivious to the storm brewing outside, nursed Dusk, his purrs a steady rhythm that grounded them all. Ellie watched him, marveling at his calm, and wished she could borrow it. A knock at the door broke the spell. James Lawson stood on the porch, his gray beard flecked with dust from his bookstore, his eyes kind but troubled. "Heard the talk," he said, stepping inside. "Thought you could use a friend." Ellie managed a smile, offering him iced tea as they sat. Jim's presence was a balm. He'd championed Whiskers from the start, tying his deeds to Charleston's legacy of compassion. "Folks'll come around," he said, sipping his tea. "They always do when the truth shows up." But his optimism faltered as he glanced at the puppies, sensing the weight of suspicion. Sophie showed Jim her sketches, her voice brightening. "This is Onyx. He's the bravest," she said, pointing to a drawing. Jim chuckled, but his eyes met Ellie's, a silent question passing between them. "Any idea where they're coming from?" he asked, keeping his tone light for Sophie's sake. Ellie shook her head, her fingers twisting her cardigan. "Whiskers goes to the river," she said. "That's all we know." Jim nodded, his thoughts turning to Charleston's hidden corners. Alleys and abandoned lots where secrets festered. The conversation was cut short by another knock, heavier this time. Ellie opened the door to find Officer Daniel Coleman, his police badge glinting in the sun. At 55, Dan was a familiar face, patrolling Rainbow Row with a quiet authority, but his presence now sent a chill through her. "Morning, Ellie," he said, his voice even. "Got a few complaints about Whiskers. Mind if I come in?" Ellie's heart sank, but she stepped aside, gesturing to the living room. Sophie froze, clutching her notebook, while Bill stood, his arms crossed, his gardener's calm giving way to defiance. Dan's eyes softened at the sight of the puppies. Whiskers curled protectively around them. "Quite a crew," he said, almost to himself. He knelt, studying Whiskers, and Ellie caught a flicker of something personal. A memory, perhaps. "Folks are saying he's taking these pups from another dog," Dan said, standing. "Dorothy Harper's been loud about it." Ellie's jaw tightened. "Whiskers isn't stealing," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "He's saving them. We just don't know from what." Sophie stepped forward, her voice shaking. "He loves them," she said, pointing to the pen. "Look at him." Dan's gaze lingered on Whiskers, and he nodded slowly. "I had a cat once," he said, almost absently. "Tabby. Used to drag socks to my bed like they were treasure." The admission eased the tension, but his tone hardened slightly. "Still, I need to look into it. For everyone's sake." Ellie nodded, her throat tight, knowing Dan's duty wasn't personal, but fearing where it might lead. As Dan left, promising to return, Ellie felt the walls close in. She glanced at Sophie, whose eyes brimmed with tears, and pulled her close. "We'll figure this out," she whispered, though her own certainty wavered. Bill paced, his boots scuffing the floor. "Dot's stirring a hornet's nest," he said, his voice low. "We need answers before this gets worse." Ellie agreed, but the river's pull on Whiskers felt like a riddle too vast for their grasp. That afternoon they attended a gathering at St. Michael's Church, a Charleston cornerstone with its white steeple piercing the sky. The event, a fundraiser for the local shelter, drew neighbors under the church's oak-shaded lawn. Ellie hoped it might shift focus from the rumors, but Dot was there, her straw hat tilted, her voice carrying as she spoke to a cluster of women. "That cat's causing trouble," she said, loud enough for Ellie to hear. "Who knows what he's taking next?" The words stung, and Ellie gripped Sophie's hand, steering her toward Jim's book table. Jim was reading aloud, his voice weaving a tale of Charleston's resilience, a fisherman saving a shipwrecked crew. Sophie listened, her notebook tucked away, but Ellie caught the sidelong glances from others, their whispers like nettles. She spotted a stranger near the church gate, a man in a faded cap watching their group with a camera in hand. Her pulse quickened. Why was he here? Was he tied to the rumors, or something else? She nudged Bill, who followed her gaze, his jaw tightening. "Probably just a tourist," he muttered, but his eyes stayed sharp. Back home the puppies yipped, oblivious to the storm brewing. Whiskers tended to mist, his purrs a quiet defiance, but Ellie felt trapped. She sat by the pen, her fingers brushing Whiskers' fur, and thought of her son, his silence, her unanswered letters. Whiskers was fighting for these pups just as she fought to hold her family together. But the neighborhood's doubt, Dot's venom, and that stranger's gaze were closing in, and she wondered how long they could stand against it. The Charleston dusk painted the sky in shades of amber, its glow softening the cobblestone alleys that wound toward the Ashley River. Sophie stood at the Bennetts' living room window, her nose pressed to the glass, her hazel eyes tracking Whiskers as he slipped through the garden gate. His golden fur flashed briefly, then vanished into the shadows, his nightly quest pulling him back to the river. At 11, Sophie felt his absence like a missing heartbeat, her notebook untouched since the church gathering. The rumors, Officer Dan's visit, and that stranger's camera had shaken her, and she was determined to prove Whiskers' innocence. Ellie sat in her armchair, a poetry book open but unread, her gray eyes heavy with worry. She'd seen Sophie's restlessness, the way her fingers twisted her shirt when Dan left. "Sweetheart, come away from there," she said, her voice gentle but firm. Sophie turned, her face set. "He's not stealing, Grandma," she said, her voice trembling with conviction. "I know he's not." Ellie nodded, her heart aching for the girl's faith, but her own doubts gnawed. Where was Whiskers going, and what was he facing alone? Bill was in the kitchen, scrubbing dishes with more force than needed, his weathered hands betraying his frustration. "Whole street's gone crazy," he muttered, loud enough for Ellie to hear. He'd spotted the stranger again that morning, lingering near their fence, and though he'd brushed it off as paranoia, it lingered like a bad dream. The puppies yipped in their pen, tumbling over Whisker's empty spot, and Bill glanced at them, his gruffness softening. "Dang cat's got us all twisted up," he said, almost to himself, but Ellie knew he'd fight for Whiskers as fiercely as she would. Sophie couldn't wait any longer. She'd overheard Ellie and Bill talking about the river, about finding answers, but their caution felt too slow. Whiskers was out there, and she needed to know why. As Ellie turned to check on the puppies, Sophie grabbed her sneakers, slipping out the back door into the twilight. The Charleston air was thick, scented with marsh grass and salt, and she moved quietly, her small frame hugging the shadows of Rainbow Rose pastel homes. Her heart pounded, but her love for Whiskers pushed her forward, down alleys she'd only seen by day. Whiskers' trail led to a crumbling house near the river, its windows boarded, its yard choked with weeds. Sophie crouched behind a palmetto, her breath shallow as she spotted him, a golden flicker against the dusk. He squeezed through a broken fence, his movements deliberate, and she heard a faint whimper from inside. Fear gripped her. Was it another puppy, or something dangerous? She edged closer, her sneakers catching on roots, but a rustle in the bushes stopped her cold. Eyes glinting in the dark, a raccoon, maybe, or worse, sent her scrambling back, her courage faltering. At home, Ellie noticed Sophie's absence, her poetry book dropping to the floor. "Sophie," she called, checking the kitchen, then the garden, her voice rising with panic. Bill joined her, his boots thudding as they searched the house. "She's gone after him," Ellie said, her chest tight, picturing Whisker's river path. Bill grabbed a flashlight, his jaw set. "We'll find her," he said, but his eyes betrayed fear, not just for Sophie, but for what lay beyond their safe world. Sophie reached the garden gate just as Ellie's voice called her name. She slipped inside, muddy and breathless, her face pale but resolute. "I saw him, Grandma," she said, her words tumbling out. "There's a house by the river. Something's there, whimpering." Ellie pulled her close, relief warring with dread, while Bill knelt, checking her for scrapes. "You can't run off like that," he said, his voice rough but gentle. Sophie's eyes brimmed, but she held up her notebook, where she'd sketched the house's jagged roof. "Whiskers is helping someone," she insisted, her voice fierce. Ellie studied the sketch, her mind racing. The river house, abandoned, half forgotten, was a place of rumors, whispered about by kids and avoided by adults. She'd heard of strays hiding there, of broken lives left to rot. Was that Whisker's secret? She glanced at Bill, who nodded, reading her thoughts. "I'll check it tomorrow," he said, but Ellie shook her head. "We need to know now," she said, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her gut. They couldn't wait for Dan or gossip to decide Whisker's fate. Across the street, Dorothy Harper watched from her porch, her broom idle, her lips pursed. She'd seen Sophie's dash, the Bennets' frantic search, and her mind spun a darker tale. Whiskers leading the girl into trouble, stirring chaos. Dot didn't know about the house, but her distrust flared, fueled by years of guarding her heart. She turned inside, her footsteps heavy, unaware that the truth was closer than she feared, waiting to unravel in the river's shadow. Back in the living room, the puppy slept, their tiny snores filling the silence. Whiskers returned at dawn, his fur damp, curling around Onyx, with a tired purr. Ellie watched him, Sophie's sketch in hand, and felt a resolve harden. The river held answers, about the puppies, about Whiskers' heart, and she'd face it, for him and for them all. But as she looked at Sophie, asleep on the couch, she wondered what cost those answers might bring, and whether Charleston's heart could hold them. The Charleston dawn broke in a shroud of fog, the Ashley River's breath curling through the alleys and wrapping the old house in a ghostly veil. Ellie Bennet stood at her kitchen window, her gray eyes tracing the garden where Whiskers had slipped out hours ago. Sophie's sketch of the crumbling river house lay on the counter, its jagged lines a map to the unknown. Ellie's heart thudded with resolve. She'd promised to uncover Whiskers' secret, but the weight of it pressed harder now, after Sophie's reckless chase last night. The puppy's yips drifted from the living room, a reminder of the stakes, and she gripped her coffee mug, willing her hands to steady. Sophie sat at the table, her hazel eyes shadowed, her notebook open to a new page, a crude drawing of Whiskers carrying a puppy through fog. At 11, she felt the sting of Ellie's scolding for sneaking out, but her faith in Whiskers burned brighter than her guilt. "He's saving them, Grandma," she said, her voice soft but sure. Ellie nodded, her throat tight. She wanted to believe it, but the rumors, Dorothy Harper's sharp words, the neighborhood's sidelong glances, clouded her hope. Whiskers wasn't a thief, but what was he facing out there, alone? Bill shuffled in, his flannel shirt rumpled from a sleepless night, his weathered face set. "I'm going to that house," he said, grabbing his flashlight. "No more waiting." Ellie hesitated, picturing the river's edge, wild, forgotten, a place Charleston left to its ghosts. "Not alone," she said, her voice firm. "We need help." Bill grunted, but his eyes flicked to Sophie, and he nodded, knowing the girl's safety came first. The puppies, Onyx, Dusk, Ember, Raven, and Mist, tumbled in their pen, oblivious, but Whiskers' absence left a void, his golden warmth missing from their chaos. Ellie called James Lawson, her voice steady despite her nerves. Jim arrived within the hour, his gray beard damp from the fog, his bookstore tales swapped for practical grit. "I know that place," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Old fishing shack, abandoned years ago. Strays hide out there sometimes." Sophie perked up, clutching her notebook, but Ellie's stomach nodded. Strays meant danger, hunger, maybe worse. She glanced at Bill, who was already pulling on his boots, his gardener's calm giving way to urgency. They decided to involve Officer Daniel Coleman, needing someone official to keep things grounded. Dan met them at the garden gate, his badge glinting faintly, his face etched with curiosity. At 55, he'd seen Charleston's quirks, ghost stories, bar fights, but a cat rescuing puppies was new. "Heard about Sophie's adventure," he said, his tone gentle but probing. Sophie blushed, hiding behind Ellie, but Dan knelt, meeting her eyes. "You're brave, kid," he said, "but let us handle this." Ellie caught a warmth in his voice, a hint of the man who'd loved a cat named Tabby, and it eased her fear, if only a little. The group set out, leaving Sophie with a neighbor, a friend of Jim's who promised stories and cookies. The fog thickened as they reached the river, its marshy scent mingling with decay. The house loomed ahead, its boards warped, its roof sagging like a tired sigh. Bill led the way, flashlight cutting through the mist, while Jim scanned for signs of life. Dan stayed close, his hand near his radio, though his eyes held more wonder than suspicion. Ellie clutched Sophie's sketch, her cardigan catching on brambles, her thoughts on Whiskers. Was he here, even now? Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and desperation. Broken furniture littered the floor, and a faint whimper echoed from the back. Bill froze, his beam landing on a skeletal black dog, curled in a corner beside empty cans. Her eyes, dull with exhaustion, met theirs, and Ellie's breath caught. She was the puppy's mother, too weak to stand, let alone nurse. "Lord have mercy," Jim whispered, kneeling beside her. Dan stepped forward, his voice low. "She's been here a while. No way she could care for those pups." Ellie's mind raced, piecing it together. Whiskers hadn't stolen the puppies. He'd saved them, one by one, from a mother too frail to help. She pictured his nightly treks, his gentle jaws carrying onyx, then dusk, through this forsaken place. Her eyes stung, pride and sorrow mixing as she saw his grief reborn as courage. Bill crouched, offering the dog water from his flask, his hands gentle despite their roughness. "We gotta get her out," he said, his voice thick. Dan nodded, already calling Maggie Tate, his radio crackling with urgency. Jim found a blanket in the truck, wrapping the dog. Bella, Ellie named her, silently for her quiet beauty. They carried her to Maggie's clinic, the fog parting as Charleston steeples emerged in the distance. Maggie met them at the door, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes widening at Bella's state. "Severe malnutrition," she said, hooking up an IV, "but she's a fighter." Ellie watched Bella's shallow breaths, her thoughts on Whiskers. His instinct had been right, his heart truer than any rumor. Dan lingered, his badge forgotten as he spoke of Tabby, his old cat who'd once brought him a lost bird. "Whiskers is special," he said, meeting Ellie's gaze. "Most folks wouldn't believe it, but I do." His words were a lifeline, cutting through the doubt that had choked Rainbow Row. Bill clapped his shoulder, a rare gesture, while Jim vowed to spread the truth. His storyteller's spark reignited. Ellie felt a weight lift, though questions remained. How would the neighborhood react, and what of Whiskers' role now? Back home, Whiskers returned, curling around Raven with a tired purr. Sophie, back from the neighbors, ran to him, her tears falling as Ellie explained. "You were right," Ellie said, hugging her, Sophie's notebook clutched tight. But as they watched the puppies, Ellie sensed a new challenge. Bella's recovery, the community's trust, and Whiskers' heart, still tethered to his unlikely brood. The river's secret was out, but its ripples were just beginning to spread. Charleston's Marion Square glowed with autumn's first breath, the air crisp as the community fair unfolded under live oaks strung with lanterns. Stalls brimmed with low-country treats, shrimp fritters, pecan pies, jars of crimson jam, while children darted through the crowd, their laughter mingling with a fiddler's tune. Ellie walked beside Sophie, her cardigan swapped for a light jacket, her gray eyes scanning the faces around them. Whiskers' story had hit the Post and Courier that morning, a front-page spread titled "Charleston Cat Saves Puppies," and the square buzzed with its echo, though not all voices sang his praise. Sophie clutched her notebook, her hazel eyes bright with hope, her sketches of onyx, dusk, ember, raven, and mist tucked inside. At 11, she felt the weight of the truth. Whiskers had saved Bella's pups, carried them from a rotting shack to their home. but the rumors lingered, sharp as marsh thorns. "They'll believe him now, right, Grandma?" she asked, her voice small against the fair's hum. Ellie squeezed her hand, wanting to promise yes. But Dorothy Harper's shadow loomed, her doubt a stubborn weed in Rainbow Row's garden. Bill trailed behind, his boots scuffing the grass. A bag of kibble slung over his shoulder, a donation for the puppies, now thriving under Maggie Tate's care. Bella was gaining strength, her black fur glinting again, and the clinic had become a hub for neighbors dropping off blankets and treats. Bill's gruffness hid a quiet pride, though he'd caught Dot's glare at the fair's edge, her straw hat tilted like a warning. "She's not lettin' go," he muttered to Ellie, nodding toward Dot. Ellie sighed, her heart heavy. Truth was a slow healer, especially against a wound like Dot's. James Lawson stood at a bookstall, his gray beard catching the lantern light as he read from a low-country tale of redemption, a ship captain saving a stranded crew. His voice wove Whisker's story into it, drawing gasps from listeners. Sophie tugged Ellie closer, her face glowing as Jim described Whisker's river treks, his gentle jaws cradling each pup. "Charleston's got heroes in fur," Jim said, winking at Sophie, who clutched her notebook tighter, ready to read her own account if asked. Maggie Tate joined them, her vet bag swapped for a basket of biscuits for the crowd. "Bella's a miracle," she said, her dark eyes warm. "And Whiskers, he's the heart of it." She'd set up a donation jar at her clinic, its coins piling high for Bella's care, a sign the neighborhood was softening. Ellie smiled, her hope flickering, but it dimmed as Dot approached, her lips pursed, her voice cutting through the music. "Fine story," she said, loud enough to turn heads, but who's to say that Cat didn't cause the trouble first? The words landed like a slap. Sophie froze, her notebook slipping, and Ellie stepped forward, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "Dorothy, you don't know what he did," she said, her gray eyes locking with Dot's. "He saved those pups when no one else could." Dot's face hardened, but a flicker crossed her eyes, something raw, unguarded. She turned away, her broom hand twitching, and Ellie sensed a crack in her armor, though it wasn't wide enough yet. A quieter moment came at dusk when Dot knocked on the Bennett's door, her straw hat in hand. Ellie opened it, startled, and saw a softness in Dot's face she hadn't expected. "I heard about the dog," Dot said, her voice halting. "Bella." She paused, her eyes dropping. "I had a dog once. Daisy. Got hit by a car years back. Made me wary of strays." The confession hung between them, fragile as marsh fog, and Ellie's anger melted. "I'm sorry, Dot," she said, stepping aside. "Want to meet the pups?" Dot hesitated, then nodded, following Ellie to the living room. Whiskers lay in the pen, Onyx curled against him, his purrs a steady hum. Dot knelt, her fingers brushing Dusk's fur, and her eyes glistened. "Didn't think a cat could do this," she murmured, almost to herself. Sophie watched, her notebook forgotten, her heart swelling as Dot's frown faded. "He loves them," Sophie said, her voice soft, and Dot nodded, a tear slipping free. "I see that now," she said, standing. "I was wrong, Ellie." Ellie hugged her, a gesture that surprised them both, and Dot left with a promise to bring treats tomorrow. The fair's glow lingered outside, its music drifting through the windows, but the real victory was here. Dot's heart, softened by truth, a step toward healing Rainbow Row. Bill clapped Sophie's shoulder, his gruffness hiding pride, while Ellie sat by Whiskers, her fingers in his fur. Bella was mending, the puppies thriving, but she saw Whiskers' eyes drift to the pen, a quiet shift. Was he preparing to let go? The square emptied as stars emerged, and Sophie read her diary to Jim's book club, her voice carrying Whisker's saga to new ears. Neighbors listened, some skeptical, others teary, and Ellie felt Charleston's pulse, flawed, human, but capable of grace. She thought of her son, of the letter she'd mailed yesterday, hoping for a reply. Whiskers had mended their home and now their street, but his own heart remained a mystery, its next chapter waiting to unfold as Bella's strength grew and the puppy's future loomed. The Charleston autumn sun dipped low, painting the battery's seawall in shades of amber and rose as gulls wheeled above the harbor. Ellie Bennett walked slowly, her gray eyes tracing the cannon-lined path where she'd found Whiskers years ago. Sophie skipped ahead, her hazel eyes bright, her notebook tucked under her arm, its pages worn from tales of their golden cat. Bill trailed behind, his boots steady on the cobblestones, his weathered face softened by a rare smile. Whiskers padded beside them, his emerald eyes calm, his fur catching the light like a quiet flame. The city hummed with its usual rhythm, carriages clopping, neighbors waving. But for the Bennetts, today was the milestone, a closing of a chapter that had reshaped their world. At the seawall's edge, a young couple waited, their pickup parked nearby. Bella stood between them, her black fur sleek again, her eyes lively as she nuzzled 5 tumbling puppies, Onyx, Dusk, Ember, Raven, and Mist. Maggie Tate had cleared Bella for adoption, her recovery a testament to Charleston's care. And this family, locals with a farm near Somerville, had fallen for her and her brood. Sophie knelt, hugging Onyx, her voice thick. "You'll have a big yard," she whispered, stroking his ears. Whiskers sat on a bench, watching, his tail still, his purrs silent but steady, as if he understood the moment's weight. Ellie's heart ached, though pride tempered the pain. She'd watched Whiskers nurse these pups. His grief for his lost kittens poured into their survival. Now he let Bella lead, her gentle nudges guiding Dusk and Ember back to her side. Whisker's eyes met Ellie's, and she saw peace there, a quiet acceptance that eased her own farewell. She thought of her son. His letter had arrived yesterday, promising a Christmas visit, a crack in the distance between them. Whiskers had taught her to hope, to hold space for healing, and she felt that lesson now, warm as the low-country sun. Bill crouched beside Sophie, his hand on her shoulder. "They're gonna be fine," he said, his gruffness soft, his eyes on Mist, who yipped at a passing gull. He'd grumbled about the puppy's chaos, but Ellie knew he'd missed their clamor, just as he'd grown to love Whisker's sly charm. The couple, kind-eyed and patient, promised visits, barbecues, playdates, a thread to keep the Bennetts close. Sophie nodded, wiping her cheeks, and handed Raven to the woman, her fingers lingering. "Tell them Whiskers saved them," she said, her voice firm. Whiskers leaped to Sophie's lap, his purrs rumbling as she hugged him. Ellie sat beside them, her cardigan brushing his fur, and felt Charleston's pulse, its steeples, its marshes, its stories of grace. She'd shared Whisker's saga at her book club last night, her voice steady as she spoke of loss and redemption. The women, some tearful, others nodding, had seen their own lives in the tale, pets loved and lost, families mended through time. Dorothy Harper, now a regular visitor with treats for Bella, had listened quietly, her once sharp edges softened by truth. The couple loaded the puppies into a crate, Bella hopping in beside them, her tail wagging. Sophie waved, her notebook clutched tight, already planning new stories. Bill stood, offering a rare handshake to the man, his gardener's grip firm. "Take care of 'em," he said, and the man nodded, sensing the weight behind the words. As the truck pulled away, Ellie felt a pang, but Whisker's warmth grounded her. His presence a reminder that love didn't end with goodbye. They walked home through Rainbow Row, the pastel homes glowing in twilight. Whiskers darted ahead, chasing a leaf, his old playfulness flickering back. Sophie laughed, running after him, and Ellie linked arms with Bill, her steps light. The neighborhood had changed. Dot's apology, Jim's tales, Maggie's clinic bustling with donations. Whiskers had woven them closer, his heart a spark that lit Charleston's better angels. Ellie pictured her son's visit, Sophie's stories filling their table, and knew this wasn't an end, but a new beginning. At home, Whiskers curled under the magnolia tree, its leaves rustling in the breeze. Ellie sat on the porch, Sophie beside her, reading a new tale from her notebook, A Cat Who Sailed the Stars. Bill listened, his chair creaking, his smile unguarded. The river flowed beyond, its secrets safe, its lessons learned. Whisker's eyes closed, his breaths even, and Ellie felt peace settle, deep as Charleston's roots. Love, she knew, was a circle, and Whiskers had brought theirs full, a quiet hero whose light would linger long after the stars rose. I hope you enjoyed this story. Subscribe to my channel so you don't miss touching stories. Leave a like and then comment below what you thought of the emotional stories. See you in the next video.